What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and I want to talk to you about a TV show that I finished watching yesterday, Camelot from Starz. This was a 10-episode series. I believe it was planned to last a lot longer than that. Allegedly, the reason this show ended so early was because none of the actors could get their schedules to really line up with each other. I feel like that's not the only reason that the show got canceled. I think that if this show was doing really well and people were really loving it, even if the actors couldn't get their schedules to line up, the people making the show would have tried a lot harder to keep it going. They would have made it work. They would have found ways to have the actors come in and do their parts. They would have found a way to make it work. So I feel like while the actors may not have been able to have gotten their schedules together just right, I don't think that that's the only reason the show ended. I have a feeling that a lot of people just didn't like this show. In fact, I know there are people out there who didn't really care for this show. Recently, after finishing watching it, I was reading some reviews and thoughts on the show from back when it was airing, and a lot of the people out there they didn't like this show because it's different from the King Arthur myths that are usually accepted as canon. And this is one of those weird things where if this was a Greek mythology movie, I would probably be very upset with it for taking any liberties at all with the source material. However, for some reason, I'm okay with this taking some liberties with the King Arthur story. Now, if it had taken a whole lot of liberties, that would be a different thing. But personally, I don't mind the few changes that this show makes to the story in order to tell a different story. I feel like it is still enough of a King Arthur story. It's still recognizable as a King Arthur story, even with some of these differences. For example, I saw several people complain that Joseph Fiennes was cast as Merlin. And Joseph Fiennes is not a 90-year-old man with a long gray beard and a pointy blue hat. He's not your typical Merlin. And everyone in the world was mad that they cast this young, sexy guy as Merlin. And that doesn't bother me, because the character that Joseph Fiennes is playing is a very interesting character. I have never seen a version of Merlin quite like this. Instead of being the kindly, wizened mentor, he's very rough around the edges. He's not at all kind, and he's very much willing to put Arthur in danger if it means forging him into a better king so that he can save the world, or at least save and unite Britain. And that's a very interesting twist on the character. I was very, very interested in this version of Merlin. In fact, I would go ahead and say he's my favorite version of Merlin that I've ever seen. And since I'm already talking about Fiennes as Merlin, I will go ahead and say that the acting across the board on this show is really good. You've got some really good actors here. Eva Green is playing Morgan Pendragon. That's another change that this show makes to the mythos. Usually, Morgan Le Fay is the daughter of Igraine, Arthur's mother, and Gorlois, who was a guy that was at war with Arthur's father. In this version of the story, they share a father and not a mother. And I didn't really mind that. I felt like that still worked for the story that we were getting. I feel like Morgan being kind of divided. On the one hand, she definitely wants the throne, and she's willing to do almost anything to get the throne that was almost hers before the revelation that she had a half-brother was brought out into the world. On the one hand, she's almost willing to do anything to get the throne, but on the other hand, she knows that it's not Arthur's fault that her father was kind of a scumbag who slept around and had this illegitimate child. It's not his fault, and it's not his fault that he's kind of been thrust into this situation. That's more Merlin's fault. And she knows that he's a very good person, but she's still willing to go to just about any length to try and take the throne from him. And that's a very not a 100% black or white portrayal from Eva Green, and I really like what she was doing here. I like the portrayals from most of the main characters. I can't think of anyone here that I just flat out did not like. Which might, I guess I could go ahead and talk a little bit about the guy playing Arthur. Jamie Campbell Bower. I believe he was in one of the Twilight movies. I haven't seen any of those, so I don't know, but I was looking him up, and he was credited as being in one of those. He was in, after this series, a movie called The City of Bones, or something like that. He's been in stuff, and I think that he does a really good job playing this character. In fact, I think he does almost too good of a job, if that makes sense, because at the beginning of the series, Arthur is just a scumbag. He sleeps around. In a lot of ways, he's just a very unlikable character, to the point that it was very hard for me to want to keep watching this show because he is such an unlikable character. And this is where you kind of get into treading on thin ice, because I don't mind if you have a character who's unlikable, as long as they are interesting and as long as the character arc that they are going through is interesting. But In this case, I found Arthur, at least in the beginning of this series, to be so unlikable that it was very hard for me to want to keep watching. In fact, I've had this DVD for probably half a year, and I only finished the last 5 or 6 episodes within the last week and a half or so. It just took me that long to say, okay, I've had this sitting around for a really long time, let me just go ahead and finish up the series. And that's going to sound like I'm saying that this show is really bad, and that's not what I'm saying. I like a lot of the elements of this show, but the main thing, two of the main things that kept me away from the show, one was that Jamie Campbell Bower is playing a version of Arthur that is just such a sleazeball that it was hard for me to latch onto him as a main character and want to keep watching this show about him. And the thing is, most of the time, Arthur is a boy who is thrust into the position of becoming a king. And so I don't mind the show taking him from being this almost bratty peasant boy and transforming him into a king with presence and charisma. I don't mind the show taking that journey. And by the end of the show, I totally buy that he has the presence and the charisma to lead the land and become a better king and become a better person than what he is. I totally buy that. In the last episode of this show, there's one point where he's in this really small fortress and he's able to hold off an army by himself, and I totally buy it when it's happening. It's a really epic scene, and I don't like using the word epic because I feel like it's overused a lot and it kind of loses its meaning when everyone in the world uses it to describe everything, but it really was an epic scene. And I'm watching that scene and I'm like, why couldn't we have had more of this Arthur? Why did we have to have the Arthur who's kind of whiny and petulant and feels like he's self-entitled? And I get that we're wanting to see him go from that into more of a mature character. The problem was, I feel like they took him too far in the direction of petty and self-entitled and whiny. I didn't feel like he needed to be that far in that direction in order for you to redeem him over the course of the show. But by the end, I think they did a really good job. And if I ever go back to rewatch this show, I will definitely be rewatching some of the later episodes of this show instead of the earlier ones, because those are the episodes where Bower is playing a much more likable version of King Arthur. I mentioned there were two things that made me not like this show as much as I could have. The other is the romantic subplot between Arthur and Guinevere. This is another change that this show makes to the mythos. Normally, Arthur and Guinevere are married pretty early on in his reign, and then she is having an illegal love affair with Arthur's best knight, Lancelot. In this version of the story, they kind of turn it on its head in a way that I think is interesting, and it is able to milk the story for new possibilities. In this version of the story, Arthur and Guinevere meet, and almost immediately they are in love with each other. And then we find out, oh, she's engaged to be married to Arthur's best knight, Leontes. And Leontes is not a character in Arthurian legends, and that's something that a lot of people would just be pulling their hair out. They're saying, why in the world is this show inventing new characters when you've got so many interesting characters who are already in the myth? And my answer to that is just about every version of a King Arthur story invents something new. Why are you on this show's back for creating new elements and adding them into the story? Just about everything. You have like the Mary Stuart Merlin books, or the Mary Zimmerman Bradley Mists of Avalon books, or anything that is an adaptation of the stories of Arthur or Merlin or Camelot. Almost all of them add something new to the table, but everyone is getting so angry at this show for changing elements and for adding new things, and I just didn't understand that. But what I didn't like is that you've got Guinevere, who very early in the series is married to Leontes, and they've got this romantic subplot between Arthur and Guinevere, and in like the second episode they sleep with each other. And the show wants me to believe that it's love at first sight, that these two meet each other and almost immediately they fall in love, and then they have sex with each other, and then they're both carrying around this guilt because she's married to Leontes, and if everyone finds out, then this could ruin the entire kingdom, because then the people who have hope in Arthur are going to lose that hope because, oh, he's just a man. He can succumb to his manly desires just like any other man. And that's kind of what Merlin is thinking. Towards the end of the series, when he finds out that Arthur did this, he's like, you can't tell anyone, because if you do, this will ruin everything. The kingdom will no longer be united under you like we want it to be. And that is just such a Merlin line in this show, where Merlin is willing to cover up bad things in order for the greater good. And that was why I like Merlin so much. I found him to be such an interesting character here. But the problem that I have here is that I do not buy that these two almost instantly after they meet each other fall in love, and it's like, okay, by episode 2, let's go ahead and have them have sex. And I get that you wanted a major subplot of this season to be they're having sex with each other, almost brings apart the fall of the entire kingdom, because Morgan finds out about it, and then she starts plotting and using that in her plots to try and take the throne. I get that. I feel like that should have been saved for like season 2 or 3 if they had a season 2 or 3. And I know they didn't, but these two eventually having sex and possibly bringing the fall of the kingdom down, that should have been a subplot for after these two have gotten to know each other for a little while, because I do not find their relationship here to be in any way something that I can buy at all. They meet each other and almost instantly, pants are down, let's go ahead and have sex with each other. And I just don't buy it. I feel like these two needed to get to know each other over the period of a long time before I could buy them suddenly succumbing to their urges to have sex with each other. And that's just one of those things where we wouldn't have gotten this subplot if they had tried to hold it off for a season 2 or 3, because we would not have gotten a season 2 or 3. But that subplot happening this early in the show doesn't work for me. It happens way too soon for me to find it to be believable at all. And those were really the two big elements that kept me from enjoying the show as much as I did. That Arthur is portrayed as such a scumbag early on, and I did like him by the end of the series, and also that Arthur and Guinevere's relationship, their illegal relationship, I should say, happened so early in the series before they've really had a chance to get to know each other as people. And that's just one of those things that they had an idea for a story that they wanted to do, and they went ahead and went with that story even before they found out that they were canceled. And me personally, I wish that they had held off on that story for a little bit. But overall, I really love this show. If you are a fan of Game of Thrones, which is a show that I don't watch, but what little I know about that show, it's very similar to Camelot. It's got a lot of the same themes. You've got a very adult take on the traditional fantasy story. That's what's going on here in Camelot, and from what I understand, that's a big part of Game of Thrones as well. And then I would say the one big difference is Game of Thrones has about 7,000 more characters than what Camelot does. Camelot is kind of more reined in, and so you don't have seasons upon seasons waiting for something to happen with this character before it finally does. You don't have that in Camelot because it's only 10 episodes. But I'm still a little bit upset that Game of Thrones became this huge mega hit that everyone in the world is interested in, and it's about to be on its 6th season, and then you've got Camelot, which only lasted 10 episodes. I'm still very upset about that because I am a huge King Arthur fan, and I really do wish that we could have had a good TV show that lasted several seasons adapting the story of King Arthur. And you may say, oh, well, there was Merlin that lasted 5 years. Like I said, a good TV show that lasted several years that could bring King Arthur to the people out there who don't read the stories and are familiar with the legends. So those are my thoughts on Camelot, the Starz 10-episode series. What did you guys think of this review? If you liked it, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And I will be back later in the week with some other videos, and I will see you guys then. Have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.